Hello and welcome to another Criminology video. And today's video is a bit of a public service announcement really. And the public service announcement is, do not read this book, The Shadow by James Patterson and Brian Sitz. I'll get into why you shouldn't read it in a minute. But first I want to talk a little bit about why I read it. So I have a long and appalling history of reading James Patterson's books. So I started with the Alex Cross books when they first came out. So I think I read Along Came a Spider, the very first one, not long after it came out, and I quite enjoyed it. So the first few Alex Cross books are pretty good. But then, I guess sometime in the early 2000s, Patterson kind of turned himself from a writer into a company and started publishing what I now call JPA books, so James Patterson and, where he picks up a jobbing writer. I assume Patterson writes some sort of plot down on the back of a postage stamp, gives it to the writer, and the writer churns out a book. The books are all very formulaic, and of all the ones I've read, I would say they're all very, very bad as well. And I keep on getting sucked into reading them, which annoys me. So, on to The Shadow, and why in particular I read this one, despite knowing that it was going to be bad. So, The Shadow, if you don't know, is a quite an old character, although you wouldn't know that from reading the blurb of the book. So he, I think, originally featured in radio dramas in the 1930s, and he's kind of a Batman-esque hero, so masked hero, not a superhero, and he doesn't have superpowers. Actually, he does have superpowers. The Shadow is a masked hero type character who started in radio dramas in the 1930s. I got interested in The Shadow in the 80s when he was rebooted in a short comic book series by a guy called Howard Chaykin. And this was very much in the vein of The Dark Knight Returns by Frank Miller, which was, really popular at that time and which I really liked. So kind of dark, quite brutal and violent hero bashing villain type stuff. This was in the days when we didn't all realise that Frank Miller was an awful fascist, and when it was still okay to like his stuff. The Shadow was then rebooted again, so I think after that initial comic series there were further ones, and then there was a movie in the 90s which wasn't terribly good, with Alec Baldwin as the Shadow, directed by Russell Mulcahy, who I quite like, who directed the excellent Killer Pig film Razorback, and also the classic Highlander. So yeah, that film kind of came and went without a great deal of splash in the kind of 90s comic book movie boom. And The Shadow, I think, has kind of faded a bit out of public consciousness since then. Until now, when James Patterson and Brian Sitz have published this new novel. Now, as I said, there's nothing on the blurb on the back of the book to indicate that it's anything to do with the original Shadow, and it was only because I recognised the name of the Shadow, Lamont Cranston, on the back of the book that I realised it was. And because I used to like the Shadow so much, I thought I'd give it a try, and I really wish I hadn't. It's a really, really bad book. So the plot is bizarre in the kind of way that stories where somebody grabs an old character and tries to bring up the date often are. So in this case, it starts with the Shadow in the 1930s getting drugged and going into kind of a coma, and then we skip forward to, I can't remember exactly the year, I think it's like 2085 or something like that, where a young kind of teenage girl who's a bit of a troublemaker at school but very determined, gets told by a lawyer that she's been bequeathed something in a will. She then goes to this random warehouse in the middle of nowhere and discovers the Shadow's kind of comatose body there, and this weird kind of medical guy who then revives the Shadow. And the world that the Shadow comes back into is your kind of typical young adult cliche dystopia with an evil world president oppressing everybody. And after that, I wouldn't go so far as to say there's a plot really. The book kind of rambles on. Cranston, or the Shadow's girlfriend, gets revivicated, or I think that's what they call it, something like that, gets brought back to life as well, and they proceed to battle the evil world president. There's a couple of twists, both of which are completely predictable, and the book then just kind of rambles on to the end. I read it on Kindle, as you've seen there, and it actually only goes up to 95% in the Kindle, because the last 5% is the preview of the next JPA book, which I definitely won't be reading. But because of that, I didn't realise that the book was about to end until it suddenly did. The fact that there'd been like a dramatic climax to the story completely passed me by. I was so disengaged from the book by then that I completely missed it. So that's my take on The Shadow. Obviously, your mileage may vary. Everyone has different views. I'm sure there are people out there who enjoy James Patterson books and JPA books and get a lot out of them. And if you do, more power to you. But I really don't like them at all. So my advice to you is do not read The Shadow. If you fancy a bit of a 30s masked hero, then dig out the old comics. They're a lot more fun. But I certainly wouldn't recommend reading the book. Okay, thanks for your time, and I will speak to you again soon.